Swear it, Julian. Swear you will guard her as I would as a father guards his own." The words came thin and wet from the bed where Edmund Fairfax lay dying, and the Duke of Harnwick, who had faced cannon and creditors and the cold contempt of half the peerage without so much as a tremor, felt his hand close hard around the fingers of the only man he had ever called friend. The candle by the bedside guttered. Beyond the drawn curtains a November rain worried at the glass, and the whole of Fairfax Grange seemed to hold its breath, as if the house itself understood that its master was leaving it. "You have my word," Julian said. "Before God, Edmund, she shall want for nothing while I draw breath." "Not money." Edmund's mouth twisted, half a smile, the ghost of the wit that had once made him the most sought-after man at any table in 3 counties. "Money she will have. It is not money that frightens me. It is the world, Julian. It is what the world does to a young woman who has no father to stand at her shoulder and no husband yet to guard her name. They will circle her like crows over a fallen thing. The fortune hunters, the whisperers, the great ladies with their little knives." He drew a breath that rattled. "Emmeline is worth 10 of them, but she does not yet know how cruel they can be. Promise me you will teach her. Promise me you will keep her from harm until she is safely and honorably wed to a man who deserves her." "I promise." "Like a father, Julian." The dying man's eyes fixed on him with a sudden fierce clarity, the last flaring of the flame. "Not as a guardian who signs papers and forgets her at some school. Like a father. Let her have your house and your protection and your name over her so that no man dares approach her but through you. Give her that." "She shall have all of it," Julian said, and he meant it with the whole of his hard, careful heart. "I will guard her as though she were my own blood. You have my sacred word." Edmund Fairfax closed his eyes then, and something in his ruined face eased, and he said, very softly, "Then I can go." He was gone before the clock on the mantel struck the half-hour. The Duke sat a long while in the dark after the physician had drawn the sheet, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed. He was 37 years old, and he had buried a great many people, his father, his mother, a brother lost at sea before he was 20, a wife he had never loved dead of a fever in the 2nd year of a marriage arranged by families who cared nothing for either of them. He had learned long ago to carry grief the way a soldier carries a pack, evenly, without complaint, so that no one might see the weight of it. But this grief was different. Edmund had been the one man before whom he need not perform. Edmund had known him as a boy at Eton, sullen and proud and lonely, and had befriended him for no reason at all except kindness, and had never once let him go. And now Edmund had given him his daughter to keep. The Duke had met the girl perhaps 3 times in his life. Once at a christening, when he had stood godfather and held a squalling bundle of lace with an expression of such open terror that Edmund had laughed until he wept. Once at some birthday, a solemn small figure of 6 who had shown him a robin's nest with the gravity of a scholar presenting a treatise. And once, years ago, a coltish creature of 15 at a summer picnic who had beaten him soundly at battledore, and then apologized for it with a blush. That was the whole of his knowledge of Emmeline Fairfax. She had been away, first at her aunt's in Bath, then at a seminary for young ladies in Cheltenham, then 2 seasons abroad with a cousin who had married an Italian count. He had a vague notion of her as a bright, distant thing, more idea than person, a name in Edmund's letters that always made his friend's handwriting grow warmer. She was 21 now, or perhaps 22. He was not certain. He would have to find out. He would have to find out a great many things, he thought, rubbing his hands over his tired face, for he had just made himself father to a grown woman he did not know, and he had not the smallest idea how such a thing was done. The funeral was 3 days later, a gray affair beneath a sky the color of pewter, the little church at Fairfax so crowded that men stood in the yard with their hats in their hands. Julian stood at the graveside as the chief mourner, for there was no near male relation living, and it was to him that the neighborhood turned its curious, sidelong glances. He bore them as he bore everything, with a still face and a straight back. But when the first cold clod struck the coffin, he made himself look across the open grave, and he saw her for the first time as a woman. Emmeline Fairfax stood very upright in unrelieved black, her face pale beneath the brim of her bonnet. A single dark curl escaped against her cheek. She was not weeping. He noticed that at once and thought better of her for it, not because grief was shameful, but because he understood the discipline it took to stand so still with the world watching, to hold sorrow behind a composed face rather than spend it before strangers. Her chin did not tremble. Only her hands, clasped before her in worn black gloves, betrayed her, gripping one another so tightly that the knuckles showed white through the kid. She was watching the earth fall on her father, and she was holding herself together by main force, and she was doing it alone. Something moved in the Duke's chest, unfamiliar and painful, and he named it protectiveness and was glad to have a name for it. Edmund had asked him to stand at her shoulder. Very well, he would stand there now. When the service ended and the mourners drifted toward their carriages, he crossed the churchyard to her. She looked up at him, and he was struck by her eyes, which were a clear gray-green like water over stone, and swollen faintly at the rims, though she had not let a tear fall. She knew him. He saw the recognition, and the effort she made to summon courtesy from the wreck of the day. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was low and even. "You were very good to come. My father spoke of you always with the greatest love. I know it would have grieved him to think of you troubling yourself." "It is no trouble to bury a friend," Julian said, "though God knows it is a hard one." He paused. He had rehearsed nothing, and he found now that all his careful sentences had deserted him. "Miss Fairfax, your father and I spoke at the last. He did me the honor of entrusting your welfare to my care. I am, by his wish and by the arrangement of his will, your guardian now." He watched her take this in. Something crossed her face, surprise, and then a kind of weary bracing, as of one who has learned that the world will keep arriving with new burdens and that there is nothing to be done but shoulder them. "I see," she said. "I did not know. He kept so much from me these last months. He did not wish me to be frightened, I think." Her mouth trembled at last, only for an instant, and she mastered it. "I am not a child, your Grace. I would not have you feel bound by a sick man's fears. I can manage a great deal on my own." "I do not doubt it," he said gravely. "I have heard how you managed my battledore some years since." And he was rewarded absurdly by the smallest flicker of something at the corner of her mouth, quickly gone. "But your father asked a thing of me, and I gave my word, and I do not give it lightly. You will come to Harnwick. You will have my protection and my house and every honor due the daughter of the best man I ever knew. There is no debate in it. It is only a question of when your trunks are packed." "Yes?" She looked at him a long moment. He could not read her, he, who had spent 20 years reading the faces of men across baize tables and negotiation and the floor of the house. He found the fact unsettling and did not examine why. Then she inclined her head and said simply, "Thank you," and the word carried a weight of relief she was too proud to speak aloud, and he understood that beneath her composure she had been more frightened of her future than she would ever confess. She came to Harnwick a fortnight later, when the lawyers had done their first murmuring over the estate, and the house at Fairfax had been shut up under Holland covers. The Duke's seat was a vast gray pile of a place in the north of the county, older than the title, its long gallery hung with dead Harnwicks in ruffs and armor, its park stretching to a horizon of bare oaks, and a lake that lay like beaten lead under the winter sky. He had lived in it alone for years, he and the servants and the ghosts, and he had told himself he preferred it so. He stood on the steps in the raw afternoon to receive her, and watched the traveling carriage come up the long drive, and was aware of an unaccustomed disquiet, as though the house were about to change in some way he could not yet measure. She descended stiff and cold from the long journey, her companion a Miss Grafton, a colorless gentlewoman of middle years engaged for propriety's sake, climbing down gray-faced behind her. Emmeline looked up at the great front of Harnwick, at its 100 windows catching the last of the light, and Julian saw her square her small shoulders as if to face an army. "It is very large," she said. "It is very cold," he answered, "and half the chimneys smoke, and the east wing has not been opened in my lifetime. You will find it less grand than it looks and more comfortable than you fear. Mrs. Penhallow has aired the blue rooms for you. They face south. You will have the morning sun when there is any." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation she laid her gloved hand upon it, light as a bird, and he led her in out of the cold. Mrs. Penhallow, the housekeeper, a stout and shrewd woman who had known the Duke since he was in short coats, was waiting in the hall with a fire built high and a candle in her hand, and she took one look at the thin, pale, upright young woman on her master's arm, and something maternal and immovable settled over her face. "There now," she said, as though Emmeline were a chilled traveller and not a duke's ward, "you'll be perished through. Come to the fire, miss, and I'll have hot bricks in your bed and a posset before you can say the word. Gower, Gower, take Miss Fairfax's cloak, it's soaked at the hem." Gower the butler, grave and silver-haired, took the cloak with a bow that would not have disgraced a coronation. And the Duke, watching, felt the strangest thing. He felt his cold house grow warm around this young woman, as though she had brought a light in with her that he had not known was missing. That night he dined with her, the two of them, and the mute, exhausted Miss Grafton at one end of a table built for 40, the candlelight pooling gold on the dark polished wood and losing itself in the shadows overhead. Emmeline ate little. She answered his questions with grave courtesy. Yes, the journey had been tedious. No, she was not too tired. She was very sensible of his kindness. But it was when he set himself to draw her out, asking of her time in Italy, that he saw the real woman surface beneath the grief and the good manners. For her face kindled when she spoke of Florence, of the pictures, of an old blind man who had sold roasted chestnuts by a bridge and sung to himself in the evenings. She spoke well and saw truly, and once, describing some absurdity of her Italian cousin's household, she made him laugh aloud, a rusty, surprised sound that seemed to startle her as much as it did him. "I did not think," she said, "that your Grace laughed." "I am told it happens," he said, "perhaps twice a year. You have used up a great portion of my allowance in a single evening. You must be careful, or there will be none left for Christmas." And she smiled, a real smile, tired and unguarded, that changed her whole face, and the Duke looked away from it into his wine, and did not know why he had needed to. He lay awake that night longer than was his custom, listening to the old house settle and tick around him, and he thought about the promise he had made to a dying man, like a father. He turned the phrase over. He was not so very much older than she, 16 years perhaps, no more, and yet the difference felt to him as vast as an age, for he had lived hard and buried much, and she stood at the very beginning of her life with all her hopes still folded up inside her like a letter unopened. She was his charge, his to guard, to steer, to place at last, safe and honored, into the keeping of some worthy man. That was the whole of his office, and he embraced it, for it was a thing he could do for Edmund that Edmund could no longer do for himself, and there was a kind of peace in the duty of it. He would be father to her. He would be the steady wall at her back against which the world could break in vain. He would find her a husband in a season or two, some decent, honorable fellow with a good name and a kind temper, and he would give her away with his blessing, and watch her go into a happiness she deserved, and he would be content in the knowing of it. That was what he resolved, lying in the dark of his ancestral bed, with the rain returned against the windows and the whole great house asleep around him, and the memory of her tired, real smile hanging in the air before his closed eyes like the afterimage of a candle. He did not yet know what he had promised. He did not yet understand that a man may guard a citadel against every enemy in the world, and never think to guard it against his own heart. He only knew that Emmeline Fairfax slept somewhere down the long, cold corridors of his house, under his roof and his protection, and that for the first time in a great many years the house did not feel empty. He told himself that this was comfort. He told himself that this was the quiet satisfaction of a duty well begun, and for a while in the darkness he believed it. The winter closed in over Harnwick, and with it came the slow, strange business of learning to share a house. The Duke was a man of fixed habits. He rose early, rode the home farm regardless of weather, spent his mornings shut in the estate room with his steward Mr. Halloran over the ledgers and the drainage and the endless small wars of tenancy, and his afternoons in the library among his books and his silence. He had arranged his whole existence to require nothing of anyone and to give nothing away, and he had thought it a settled thing, the shape of his life fixed as the shape of the hills. Now there was a young woman in the house, and the shape of everything shifted by degrees so small he could not have named the day it changed. He began to notice things. He noticed that the pianoforte in the long drawing-room, silent since his mother's death, had been opened, and that in the late afternoons a thread of music would find its way down the cold corridors to the library, Emmeline playing, not for anyone, only for herself, the way a person hums who thinks she is alone. She played gravely and rather well, and sometimes she stopped in the middle of a phrase as if grief had reached up and taken her by the throat, and there would be a long silence, and then she would begin again more softly. He found himself, on those afternoons, sitting with an unread book on his knee, listening. He told himself he was merely glad the instrument was used. He noticed that she was kind to the servants, and that they had, within a fortnight, quietly and completely adopted her. Mrs. Penhallow spoke of her as though she were a treasure grudgingly lent and must be guarded against the careless world. The scullery maids grew pink when she thanked them. Old Gower, who had served 3 generations of Harnwicks and unbent for none of them, was observed to have set a small vase of the last chrysanthemums on her breakfast tray, an attention of such unprecedented tenderness that the Duke, told of it, did not know whether to laugh or to be moved. He noticed, above all, that she was lonely, and that she hid it well, and that she was trying with a kind of stubborn courage to make a life out of the wreck of the one she had lost. She rose early, too. She walked in the frozen gardens with her cloak wrapped tight and her breath smoking, and she read enormously. He found her one gray morning perched on the library ladder with a folio of Italian engravings across her knees, so lost in it that she had not heard him come in, and he stood a moment in the doorway watching the winter light on her bent head before he made himself known, and could not afterward have said why the sight had held him there. "You will take a chill on that ladder," he said, and she started, and nearly dropped the folio, and he crossed the room in 3 strides and caught it, and for an instant his hand closed over hers on the great worn boards, and he felt the warmth of her fingers through the cold of his own, and he took the folio and stepped back rather more quickly than the moment required. "Forgive me," she said, coloring, climbing down. "I ought to have asked. Only the library at Fairfax was small, and your Grace has such wealth here. I have never seen so many books outside a bookseller's." "They are yours to use," he said. "All of them. You need ask no leave. A house of books that no one reads is only a house of dust." He set the folio on the table and opened it to have somewhere to put his eyes that was not her flushed and eager face. "Piranesi. My grandfather bought these in Rome. You have been to Rome." "Once for a fortnight." And she was off, forgetting to be shy, leaning over the plates beside him and pointing, that arch, that ruin. She had stood beneath it. It was far larger than the engraving made it seem, and he stood beside her at the table with the winter light coming gray through the tall windows and listened to her, and was aware that he was happy, in a plain and uncomplicated way he had not been happy in years, and thought nothing of it. Why should he? A man might be glad of good company. There was no harm in it. The lawyers, meanwhile, made their measured way through the estate of the late Edmund Fairfax, and the Duke was drawn into a correspondence of some density concerning his ward's affairs, for Emmeline was, he discovered, a considerable heiress. Her father had been a careful man. There was the Grange and its lands, and there were funds in the 4% that made her a very great prize indeed. The knowledge sat uneasily with the Duke. He had promised Edmund to guard her from the crows, and here was the carrion that would draw them. Not her face, though that was fair enough, but the neat black columns of figures that any fortune hunter in England could read at a glance. "She must be protected in this above all," he said to Mr. Halloran, who had a lawyer's turn of mind though he was only a steward. "Until she is of an age and settlement to command her own fortune, no man is to have a farthing of it through marriage without my consent, and my consent will not be lightly had. I'll not have her bought. Your Grace holds the guardianship until she attains 25, Halloran confirmed, or until she marries with your approbation. The late Lord Fairfax was most particular. He wished your Grace to have the ordering of any match. The ordering of any match. The Duke sat with that phrase after Halloran had gone, turning it in the firelight. It was a great trust and a heavy one. He held, in effect, the key to her whole future. He could open the door to a good marriage or bar it against a bad one, and no man could reach her but through him. Edmund had wanted it so. Let no man approach her but through you. It was armor he had forged for her, that clause, and the Duke was grimly glad of it, and he resolved to wield it like the sword of a father. It was the coming of his aunt that first troubled the still water. The Dowager Lady Honoria, his father's sister, arrived without warning in the second week of December, sweeping into Harnwick in a great fur-lined pelisse with 2 maids and a pug, and an air of a general come to inspect a poorly run garrison. She was 70, sharp as a needle, immensely rich, immensely proper, and she had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to marry her nephew off again and being repulsed at every turn. The news of the ward had reached her in Bath, and brought her north like a hawk to a lure. So, she said, when she had established herself before the drawing-room fire with the pug on her lap and her lorgnette raised, "This is the girl." Emmeline curtsied with grave correctness. Lady Honoria examined her from head to foot as one might examine a horse at a fair, and the Duke felt an unexpected and quite improper urge to step between them. "Fairfax's daughter," the old woman pronounced at last. "You have his brow. He was a handsome man and a fool with money. No, do not color up. He left you well enough, I hear, which is more than most fools manage. Sit down, child, you make my neck ache. So, you are to live here." "His Grace has been very good to me," Emmeline said quietly. "His Grace," said Lady Honoria, turning the lorgnette upon her nephew, "has taken leave of his senses, but that is nothing new. Julian, a word." And when she had drawn him to the far window out of earshot, she dropped her voice and let the pretense of the visit fall away. "What can you be thinking of? A young unmarried woman, an heiress, under the roof of a widowed man not yet 40 and no near kin between you. Have you the least notion what the county will make of it? What every scandal-monger from here to London will make of it?" "She is my ward," Julian said, low and even. "Her father was my dearest friend. I promised him at his death that I would guard her. There is nothing in it that any honest person could." "Honest people," his aunt said crisply, "are not the difficulty. It is the other kind of whom the world holds a great abundance, and they will not trouble to be fair to you. A girl's reputation is a pane of glass, Julian. It does not matter whether the stone that breaks it is thrown in malice or in truth. Broken is broken. You cannot keep her mute up here alone with you and a paid companion who sleeps through her dinner. It will not do. It has never done." The Duke was silent. He disliked his aunt's manner intensely and had learned across 40 years that her manner was very often wrong and her judgment very often right, and that the 2 facts were unrelated. She was right now. He knew she was right. He had been so occupied with guarding Emmeline against the greed of strangers that he had not troubled to guard her against the whisper that might come, absurdly, monstrously, from her guardian's own good office. "What would you have me do?" he asked. "Marry her off," said Lady Honoria promptly. "That is what she is for. A pretty face and a fat fortune she will go in a season if you manage it. Bring her out properly. Let her be seen. Give a ball at Christmas, invite the eligible men of the county and let her make her choice among them under your eye and get her decently wed before the summer, and your difficulty is solved and your duty done. That is what her father wished, is it not? A husband for her." "It is," the Duke said. The words came harder than they ought. "It is exactly what he wished." "Then do it," said his aunt, "and do it before the talk begins, not after. I will stay through Christmas to lend the thing countenance. An old woman in the house makes all the difference. They cannot say a word against you while I am under the roof. And I will help you look the men over. I have not survived 70 years in society without learning to smell a fortune hunter at 40 paces. She rapped his arm with the folded lorgnette. You will thank me for it, though you look at me now as though I had proposed to sell her to the Turks. It is kindness, Julian. The kindest thing you can do for that child is to see her safely and quickly wed to a good man. Every month she stays here unmarried, the danger to her grows." She was right. He knew she was right. And yet as he stood at the window with the frozen park stretching gray and endless beyond the glass, the Duke was aware of a resistance in himself so strong and so unaccountable that it frightened him a little, a flat, cold refusal, somewhere below reason, at the picture his aunt had drawn. Emmeline in a ballroom, Emmeline chosen, Emmeline handed to some smiling stranger and driven away down the long avenue to a house he would never see. He crushed the feeling as he would have crushed a spark on a dry hearth. It was nothing. It was only that he had grown used to her, and men are creatures of habit, and habit resents change. He would do his duty. He had promised Edmund a husband for her, and he would find her the best that England could offer, and he would be glad of it. He said, "Very well, we will give a ball." It was that night that the dream came. He could never afterward reconstruct it. Whole dreams do not survive the waking hand that reaches to seize them. But he woke in the black hour before dawn with his heart going hard and a warmth in him that shamed him before he was even fully conscious of what it was. There had been music. There had been the long drawing-room and candlelight, and Emmeline turning in the figure of a dance with her face lifted and laughing, and she had come to him across the floor and set her hand in his, warm and certain, the way she had set it on his arm on the steps the day she came. Only in the dream it was not a ward's hand and not a father's arm, and she had looked up at him with something in her clear gray eyes that no ward should look at a guardian with, and no guardian should wish to find. And he had bent his head toward her. He sat up in the dark, breathing as though he had run a mile, and put his feet to the cold floor, and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "No," he said aloud to the empty room. His own voice frightened him. "No." He rose and lit a candle with an unsteady hand and stood at the window looking out at the moonlit park, the frost silvering the great oaks, the lake a sheet of pale iron under the winter sky. His face in the black glass was the face of a stranger, hollow-eyed, appalled. He was her guardian. He had sworn it over a dying man. She had come to him orphaned and grieving and utterly without defense, trusting him precisely because he was the one man in England she need not fear, and she slept even now at the end of the corridor in the certainty of his protection, and his sleeping mind had betrayed that trust with an ease that turned his stomach. He was 37 and she was 22. He had held her dying father's hand. The thing was monstrous. It was not to be thought of. It was quite simply forbidden by his word, by his office, by every law of honor he had ordered his hard life around, and a dream was only a dream, the mind's midnight nonsense, no more his fault than the weather. He told himself this, standing cold at the window with the candle guttering. A man could not be held to account for what visited him in sleep. He would put it from him. He would rise and ride the frost off and never think of it again. But he did not sleep again that night. And when the gray came up at last over the eastern woods and he heard, faint and far below, the first threat of the pianoforte as Emmeline rose to her own solitary mourning, the Duke of Harnwick stood very still in the middle of his cold bedchamber, a strong man with his fists closed at his sides, and understood for the first time dimly, refusing it even as he understood it, that the thing he had brought under his roof to protect might be the very thing that would undo him. He dressed. He went down. He was at breakfast exactly what he had resolved to be, grave, kind, correct, a guardian and nothing more, asking whether she had slept, remarking on the frost, mentioning that his aunt proposed a ball at Christmas and that he hoped it would not weary her too soon after her mourning. And Emmeline, pale in her black gown across the table with the chrysanthemums Gower had set beside her plate, looked up at him with her father's clear eyes and her whole trusting, orphaned heart in her face, and said that whatever his grace thought best, she was sure was right. She had learned already to place such faith in his judgment, and the Duke smiled and said something easy, and felt the words go into him like a blade turned slowly in a wound. Whatever his grace thought best, she trusted him. That was the whole of it and the horror of it and the anchor he would hold to in the hard months coming. She trusted him utterly, and he would rather have died than betray that trust by so much as a look. He would keep his word to Edmund though it killed him by inches. He would find her a husband. He would give her away. He did not yet know how much it would cost. He only knew that gray December morning that the dream had a name now, and that he must never, so long as he lived, allow it to be spoken aloud. Not to her, not to his aunt, not to the servants, not even, if he could manage it, to himself. The ball at Harnwick, given 3 nights before Christmas, was the first entertainment the old house had seen in more than a decade, and the county came to it in a state of frank and ravenous curiosity. They came, the Duke understood perfectly, to see the ward. The invitations had gone out under Lady Honoria's practiced hand, and every family of consequence within a day's drive had accepted with an eagerness that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the young heiress who had appeared mysteriously, under the roof of the county's most eligible and least approachable widower. He stood at the head of the great staircase to receive them, his aunt magnificent in gray silk and diamonds at his side, and watched the sharp, assessing eyes travel past him to the slender figure of Emmeline, come out of her deepest mourning for the evening into a gown of dove-gray silk with a black ribbon at her throat, and he felt the whole room take her measure, her face, her figure, her manner, and beneath it all ceaselessly, her fortune. She bore it beautifully. That was the thing that undid his careful composure more than any dream, the quiet valor with which she stood the ordeal of being looked at, curtsying, answering, meeting 100 strangers with a grave, steady sweetness that gave nothing away and asked for nothing. She had asked him earlier, in the moment before the first carriage came, "Will I do you think? I should not like to shame you," and he had looked at her standing there in the candlelight, frightened and resolute in her gray silk, and had wanted with an intensity that frightened him to tell her the truth, that she was the finest thing that room would hold that night or any night, and that no woman there could touch her. He had said instead, "You will do very well, Miss Fairfax," in a voice of such careful flatness that she had looked briefly hurt, and he had turned away rather than see it and hated himself. He watched her dance. He had promised himself he would not, and he did all the same from the edge of the room with a glass of untasted wine in his hand, watched her taken out by one young man after another, watched the county's sons circle her, flushed and eager, and told himself that this was well, this was the very thing he wanted, this was the market opening and the goods on display, and that he should be glad. He was not glad. Each time some smooth-faced boy set his hand at her waist to lead her into the figure, the Duke felt a muscle tighten in his jaw, and he drank the wine he had meant to leave, and despised himself for a feeling he would not name. It was late in the evening that Sir Roderick Vane was presented to her. The Duke knew him a little, knew of him, rather, which was worse. Vane was a baronet of an old but impoverished line, a man of perhaps 30, uncommonly handsome in the smooth, dark way that women found romantic, with an easy tongue and beautiful manners and a reputation, in the clubs of London, that did not bear close examination. He had come north, it was said, to visit the Fentons at Ashby, and he had come to Harnwick's ball on the strength of that connection, and the Duke, seeing him bow over Emmeline's hand with a smile of practiced warmth, felt every instinct he possessed come to sudden cold attention. He watched them dance. He watched Vane bend his handsome head to say something that made Emmeline laugh, really laugh, the first true laugh the Duke had seen from her all evening, and the sound of it went through him 2 ways at once, gladness and something darker he refused to examine. He watched Vane's eyes, which were not smiling even when his mouth was, travel once, briefly, downward and sideways in the way a man's eyes travel when he is calculating, and the Duke knew that look. He had seen it across 100 card tables. It was the look of a man reckoning the size of a pot. "You are scowling, Julian," said his aunt at his elbow, snapping her fan. "You will curdle the negus. Who is that with the Fairfax girl?" "Vane," said the Duke. "Sir Roderick Vane, a baronet from Leicestershire." "Ah," said Lady Honoria, and raised her lorgnette and looked and lowered it again, and her old face had gone shrewd and hard. "Yes, I know the name. His father drank an estate down to the paper on the walls, and the son has been living on his face and his tailor's patience ever since. He was after the Hartley girl 2 seasons ago until her father made inquiries and shut the door, and he is dancing with your ward." She turned her sharp eyes on her nephew. "This is precisely what I warned you of. The crows have found her already, and this is the biggest and blackest of them. Have a care, Julian." "I mean to," the Duke said. His voice was very quiet. He did more than mean to. When the dance ended, he crossed the room himself, not hurrying. A duke does not hurry, but arriving all the same with a certainty that made the crowd part before him. And he was at Emmeline's side as Vane returned her to it, and he looked at the baronet with the flat, level, courteous gaze that had ended more than one man's ambitions, and he said, "Sir Roderick, you are a long way from Leicestershire." "Your Grace," Vane bowed, unruffled, his smile easy. "The Fentons would have me, and I confess the reputation of your hospitality drew me, though I find, with a glance at Emmeline that was a shade too warm, that its chief ornament was not spoken of half warmly enough. Miss Fairfax dances like a dream." "Miss Fairfax," said the Duke, "is my ward and lately bereaved of her father, and I am jealous of her strength. You will forgive me if I take her to sit down." And he offered Emmeline his arm, and she took it, a little bewildered, and he led her away from Vane's smooth smile with a deliberateness that was 1 degree short of rudeness, and did not care. "You do not like him," Emmeline said, when they had reached the quieter end of the room, and he had found her a chair near a window where the cold came comfortingly off the glass. "I do not know him," the Duke corrected, "which in a man of Sir Roderick's stamp is a different thing entirely and no safer, Miss Fairfax." He stood before her and made himself speak plainly, for he had promised her father plain speaking. "I am about to sound a great deal older than I am, and a great deal duller, and you must forgive me. There will be a good many men this season and hereafter who will smile at you as that man smiled at you tonight. Some of them will want your happiness. A greater number will want your fortune and will have learned to make the two look very alike. I would not have you unhappy, and I would not have you distrust the whole world. That is no way to live. But I would have you slow. Let no man's warmth outrun your knowledge of him, and in any matter that touches your heart I would take it as a kindness, as your guardian, and as your father's friend, if you would speak to me first, before it is decided, before it is far enough gone to hurt you." She looked up at him. The candlelight lay soft along her face, and her clear eyes searched his, and there was in them a trust so complete, so unguarded, that it went through the Duke like cold water. "I will," she said simply. "I promise you I will. I have no one else in the world to guide me, your Grace, and I'm not so foolish as I may seem. My father used to say I had a great deal of sense and no experience at all, and that the two together made a dangerous kind of innocence. I should be very glad to borrow your experience if you will lend it me. I trust your judgment above my own." She trusted his judgment above her own, she had said. The Duke stood very still. He had a sudden vertiginous sense of the ground he stood on, of the vast and terrible power her trust placed in his hands, and of the thing it lay beside in his own breast, that dark, warm, unspeakable thing that woke him in the nights. She trusted him because he was safe. She had said it herself. She had no one else, and she had given him, an orphan's whole faith, the ordering of her heart. And he wanted, God forgive him, he wanted. "You may trust it," he said, and his voice was steady, and he was proud bitterly of how steady it was. "I will never counsel you but for your own good, Emmeline, that you may rely upon while I live." It was the first time he had used her Christian name. It came out of him without his willing it, and he saw her notice it, saw something soften and warm in her face at the sound of it, and he turned at once to summon a footman with lemonade, because he could not for another moment bear to look at what his own carelessness had kindled there. The talk began within the week. He heard it first from Halloran, who had it from the servants' hall, who had it from the coachmen and ladies' maids who had attended the ball and carried its gossip home to a dozen drawing-rooms. It was nothing that could be answered, nothing that could be struck down, only a whisper, a raised eyebrow, a question left artfully unfinished. The Duke of Harnwick and his ward, a young woman, an heiress, alone in that great house with him, and the way he had looked at her, had you seen it? The way he had crossed the room and taken her from Sir Roderick as though, well, as though, one did not like to say. But it was odd, was it not, in a man who had shut himself away from the world for years, to shut himself away now with a beautiful young woman under his sole protection, and no closer kinswoman than a paid companion who slept through the fish course. The chief author of the whisper, he learned, was Lady Caro, a handsome, restless, poisonous woman of 40 who had set her own cap at him years ago and never forgiven the failure, and who had a genius for the kind of remark that could not be disproved because it was never quite made. It was Lady Caro who observed, at 3 separate tea tables, that it was a very modern arrangement, who wondered aloud whether dear Lord Fairfax could truly have foreseen quite how the thing would look, who said, with a little laugh, that of course there was nothing in it, nothing at all, only that the Duke had always been such a very deep man, and one did wonder what went on behind that grave face of his. The Duke, when the whole shape of it came to him, sat a long time alone in the library with the fire dying, and made himself look at the truth without flinching, as he had trained himself across a hard life to do. The whisper was a lie. Nothing had passed between them, nothing ever would. He would sooner have cut off his hand. And yet the whisper was not, in its foul way, entirely blind, for there was a thing behind his grave face, and Lady Caro, whatever her malice, had a nose for the truth of a man's heart even when she could not have proved it in a court. He had looked at Emmeline across that ballroom in a way a guardian should not look at his ward. He knew it. And if a woman like Lady Caro could catch even the smell of it at 40 paces, then he was a greater danger to Emmeline than any fortune hunter in England, for Vane threatened only her purse, and might be seen off. But the Duke, if he were not very careful, threatened the one thing she could never recover if it were lost. Her good name, the pane of glass his aunt had spoken of, broken not by the stone of scandal but by the truth of his own guilty heart. He rose and stood at the dark window with his hands clasped hard behind his back. Below him, the frost lay blue on the terrace, and the moon rode high and cold over the sleeping park, and somewhere at the far end of the house Emmeline slept in the trusting certainty of his protection, and the Duke of Harnwick faced, at last and fully, the enemy he had let inside his own walls. He would master it. He must. He had given his word to her dying father and his silent word to her living trust, and honor was the only thing he had ever truly owned. He would find her a husband, a good one, a real one, worthy of her, not that smooth baronet with the reckoning eyes. He would give her away, and he would stand at her wedding with a still face and a straight back and let no soul living guess what it cost him. And then he would come home to his cold house and his books and his ghosts and grow old in the peace of a duty discharged. That was the road. There was no other honorable road, and he had never in his life taken any road but the honorable one, and he would not begin now, at 37, over a girl who trusted him. He told himself all of this, standing at the window in the small cold hours. And then he went up to bed and lay down in the dark and dreamed of her again. The days lengthened by minutes through the black heart of January, and the Duke, who had never in his life had occasion to mark the lengthening, found himself marking it now. For every hour of light was an hour he might contrive, by some pretext or none, to be in the same room as Emmeline, and every early dark was an hour surrendered to the ledgers and the fire and the long war with himself. His aunt, who had meant to stay only through Christmas, did not go. She gave as her reason the badness of the roads, and then the badness of her chest, and then, with a fine defiance of consistency, the excellence of the Harnwick cook, but the Duke understood her real reason well enough. She had appointed herself the guardian of the guardianship, the propriety that made the whole arrangement safe, and she would not stir from Harnwick while a young unmarried woman lived under her nephew's roof. He was grateful to her for it, more grateful than he could say. Her sharp presence at the dinner table, her lorgnette, her pug, her ceaseless flow of opinion, all of it stood between Emmeline and the whisper like a wall of gray silk, and the Duke, who had spent 40 years finding his aunt insupportable, discovered in that hard winter that he had come rather to love her. Lady Honoria had not abandoned her project of marrying Emmeline off. She had merely refined it. Having smelled out Sir Roderick Vane as a fortune hunter at the very first, she had set herself, with the energy of a woman who enjoyed nothing so much as arranging other people's lives, to find a worthier candidate before the bad one could do harm. And she had by the middle of January produced one, a Mr. Aldous Bulai, the second son of a bishop, a grave and decent young clergyman lately presented to a good living not 10 miles from Harnwick, a man of 25 with a mild handsome face, a comfortable income, an unblemished character, and his aunt pointed out with satisfaction, not the smallest need of Emmeline's money which made his intentions, should he form any, above all suspicion. "There," she said to the Duke, having contrived to seat Mr. Bulai beside Emmeline at dinner 3 times in a fortnight. "Now that is a husband. Good family, good living, good principles, and no debts. He is a trifle dull, I grant you, but dullness in a husband is a great security, Julian, whatever silly girls may think. He would make her safe and comfortable to the end of her days and never give her 1 hour's anxiety. What more can a woman want?" "A great deal more, I should hope," the Duke said, more sharply than he intended, and his aunt looked at him over the pug with her shrewd old eyes and said nothing, which was worse than if she had said everything. He could not have said which was the crueler torment, Vane's smooth courtship, which he could despise, or the worthy Mr. Bulai's, which he could not. For Bulai was everything the Duke had told himself he wanted for Emmeline. A good man, an honorable man, a man who would cherish her and keep her safe and ask nothing of her fortune, exactly the decent kind fellow he had resolved, that first night, to find her and give her away to. Here he was, provided by Providence and Lady Honoria, mild and blameless and 10 miles off. And the Duke sat at his own table and watched the good clergyman make his careful, respectful conversation to Emmeline about parish schools and the poetry of Cowper, and was seized by a jealousy so violent and so shameful that he had to set down his glass for fear his hand would betray it. Jealousy not of Vane the scoundrel, whom any man might hate, but of Bulai the saint, whom he could find no honest reason to hate at all, and who would have made Emmeline a better and a safer husband than a man of 37, with a heart full of guilt and a house full of ghosts. That was the night he understood, fully, that he was lost. For if his wish had truly been Emmeline's happiness and nothing more, he would have blessed Mr. Bulai with his whole heart. And instead he had sat at his own board and wanted to throw the man out into the January dark. He took to walking the long gallery at night, when the house was asleep, up and down between the ranks of dead Harnwicks in their ruffs and armor, wrestling. It was there near 2 in the morning that old Gower found him, Gower, who did not sleep well either in his age, and who came upon his master pacing in the cold with a single candle and stopped, and did not withdraw but stood grave and silver in the candlelight and said, "Your Grace will take a chill. Shall I have a fire lit in the library?" "No," the Duke said, and then because the hour was strange and the dark was kind and Gower had known him since he was a boy in short coats, he said a thing he had not meant to say. "Gower, you served my mother." "I had that honor, your Grace, near 30 years. "Was she happy? My father, the marriage was arranged as mine was. Was she ever happy in it?" The old man was silent a moment, choosing his words with the care of a servant who has kept a great house's secrets for half a century. "Her Grace your mother," he said at last, "was a good and gentle lady, and she did her duty faultlessly, and she was not happy, your Grace, no. His late Grace your father was a cold gentleman. He guarded himself very close. I have thought sometimes that he feared to love anything, lest it be taken from him, for he had lost much, young. And so he kept himself apart and was safe, and was never happy a day of his life, and made her Grace lonely in a full house." Gower paused, and his old eyes rested on the Duke with a gentleness that was almost a father's. "If your Grace will forgive the liberty. I have watched 3 generations of this family guard themselves cold and call it strength, and I have watched them die lonely in their great beds, every one, and leave nothing behind but the pictures on that wall. It is not my place to say more, but I have grown old in this house, and I should not like to see it happen again to a master I have known since he could not reach the door handle." And the old man bowed, and took himself off down the dark gallery, and left the Duke standing alone among his ancestors with the candle guttering, and the truth Gower had not quite spoken hanging in the cold air like his breath. It was not my place to say more, but he had said enough. He had held up to the Duke the whole long line of frozen Harnwicks, guarding themselves cold and calling it strength, dying lonely in their great beds, and had asked him, without asking, whether he meant to be the last of them. The Duke stood a long while after the old man had gone. Then he went to his cold bed and did not sleep, and rose the next morning no nearer any answer, but with Gower's quiet words lodged in him beside his aunt's, working slowly, like water under stone. The ordinary business of the wardship went on beneath all of it, and gave him, at least, an honest occupation for his hands and his conscience. There was a great deal of it. Edmund Fairfax had left his affairs in good order, but an estate does not administer itself, and the Duke found himself, that January, deep in the management of Emmeline's inheritance, the Grange to be let or kept, the tenants to be dealt with, the funds to be watched, a dozen small matters of law and money that required his signature and his judgment as her guardian. He had thought it would be dry work. He found, to his surprise, that he did not want it dry, that he wanted her to understand it, all of it, so that no man should ever again be able to prey upon her ignorance as Vane had tried to prey upon her innocence. And so he began to teach her her own affairs. He sat her down in the estate room with Halloran and the ledgers, and he showed her the columns and the rents and the 4%, and he explained to her plainly exactly what she was worth and exactly how a fortune hunter reckoned it, and how a settlement was drawn, and where the traps in it lay, and what questions a woman must ask before she trusted any man with a farthing or a promise. Halloran, a cautious man, thought it most irregular. Young ladies did not concern themselves with such things. But the Duke overruled him. She will not always have a guardian, he said, and the words cost him something he did not show. She will one day command her own fortune and her own life, and I will not have her go into that unarmed. Teach her everything. She has a better head than half the men in the county, and she will need it. And Emmeline learned. She bent over the ledgers with the same quick hunger she brought to the Piranesi and the poets, and she asked questions that made even cautious Halloran raise his brows, and within a month she understood her own affairs better than most heiresses understood them in a lifetime. The Duke watched her do it and was proud of her past all-bearing, and knew that in arming her so he was preparing her, deliberately, for the day she would no longer need him, and did it anyway because it was right, because loving her rightly meant wanting her strong and free even at the cost of himself. It was the visiting of the Grange's tenants that showed him, past all doubt, the whole of what she was. He took her, one iron-cold day at the end of January, to see the cottages on a corner of her own land where there had been sickness, a fever through 3 families, the breadwinner of one of them dead of it, a widow left with a parcel of hungry small ones and the rent owing. The Duke had meant only to survey the matter and set Halloran to arrange relief, but Emmeline went into the cottages herself. She sat in the smoke and the cold by the widow's poor fire, and took the woman's chapped hands in her own gloved ones and talked to her, not as a great lady dispensing charity, but as one grieving creature to another, of what it was to lose the one who had been your whole shelter in the world. And the Duke, standing in the low doorway with his head bent under the beam, watched the daughter of his dead friend comfort a stranger out of the fresh wound of her own loss, and felt his heart turn over in his breast with something that was no longer, and had not for a long time been, anything a father feels. She forgave the widow the rent on the spot, her own rent, hers to forgive now that she understood her affairs, and arranged, in plain practical terms, for the children to be fed and the eldest boy apprenticed, and she did it all with a competence and a tenderness so perfectly joined that the Duke could only stand and watch and love her. On the cold drive home, wrapped to the chin in furs with her breath smoking, she was silent a long while, and then she said, looking out at the bare white fields, "My father used to say that a fortune is only a tool and that the whole worth of it is in the using. I never understood him until today. I have been so wrapped in my own grief, your grace. It is good to be reminded there is a world of it outside my own door, and that I have the means to mend a little of it. Thank you for taking me. I think it is the first useful thing I have done since he died." The Duke looked at her cold, flushed face, at the tears standing bright and unspilled in her eyes, at the goodness and the strength and the plain, unconscious loveliness of her, and did not trust himself to answer for a moment. Then he said low, "Your father would have been very proud of you today, Emmeline. I know I was." And she turned from the window and looked at him, surprised and warmed, and something passed between them in the cold, close air of the carriage that neither of them named. And the Duke turned his eyes to the fields and held the reins of himself hard, and knew, with a weary certainty, that Gower was right and his aunt was right, and there was no longer any use pretending. He was not guarding a ward. He was in love with a woman, hopelessly, and no clergyman's mild suit, and no aunt's arranging, and no oath sworn over a deathbed could alter it by a hair. That evening, when he was alone at last in the library with the fire and his conscience, he took out the letters he had begun to his man of business in London, the inquiries into Sir Roderick Vane's affairs that he had been putting off, half from delicacy and half from the coward's hope that the man might simply go away. He would put them off no longer. Whatever the state of his own heart, whatever he could or could not do about it, one duty at least was clear and clean and admitted of no doubt. Vane was circling Emmeline, and Vane was almost certainly a scoundrel, and the Duke would know exactly what he was before that smooth, dark man came one step nearer. He drew the candle close and mended his pen, and began to write, quietly. Through the channels a man of his position commanded the inquiries that would, in their slow turning, bring the whole of the truth to light. He made his inquiries quietly. Through the channels a man of his position commanded, a letter to his man of business in London, another to an old acquaintance at White's who knew everyone's affairs and kept none of his own, and the answers came back through January in a slow, damning trickle. Sir Roderick Vane was ruined. Not embarrassed, not stretched, but ruined in the particular hollow way of a man who keeps up every appearance and owns nothing beneath them. The estate in Leicestershire was mortgaged past its value. There were debts of honor at 3 clubs and debts of the less honorable kind to tradesmen and moneylenders across 2 counties. There had been, the Duke's correspondent wrote in a careful hand, some unpleasantness the previous year concerning a young woman in Bath, a merchant's daughter with a good portion, an engagement half formed and then broken when the settlements were found to be less than represented. The girl's family had paid to hush it, and Vane had walked away untouched, as such men always did, and gone looking for the next portion. He was, the letter concluded, precisely what he appeared to be to any eye not blinded by his face. A hunter of fortunes, clever, patient, and entirely without conscience, and Miss Fairfax, an orphaned heiress with a soft heart and no father to make inquiries, was as fair a mark as he was ever likely to find. The Duke read the letter twice and folded it away, and his face, had anyone seen it, was not a pleasant thing to look upon. For Vane had not gone away after the ball. He had, on the contrary, established himself at the Fentons for the winter and set about a courtship of Emmeline conducted with all the patience and artistry of a man who has done such work before and profited by his errors. He was never forward, he never pressed. He appeared with an air of happy accident, wherever she was likely to be, at church, at the assemblies in the market town, on the public road where she rode with her groom, and he was charming to Miss Grafton and deferential to Lady Honoria and scrupulously, maddeningly correct to the Duke himself, and he made Emmeline laugh, and he listened to her with the flattering fixed attention that a lonely young woman starved of her father's company found harder to resist than any flattery. He talked to her of Italy, which he had visited, of music, which he affected to love, of her father, whom he professed to have admired. He was, the Duke was forced to concede, very good at his trade, and Emmeline, who was neither a fool nor a flirt, was none the less 22 and grieving and lonely in a great cold house, and the warmth of a handsome man's steady attention was a fire she had not the experience to know was painted. The Duke watched it happen and was nearly driven from his senses by the difficulty of his position. He could not simply forbid the acquaintance. Vane had given no overt cause, and to bar him without one would look exactly like the jealousy the county was already whispering of, and would wound Emmeline, who believed her guardian only stern, and might drive her, in the way of the young, straight into the arms of the man he sought to save her from. Neither could he show her the London letters, not yet. They were the word of gossiping men, unproved, and to blacken a suitor to a young woman on such evidence was to risk her thinking him unjust, and to teach her to hide from him the very confidences he had asked her to bring. He was bound hand and foot by his own honor and by the delicacy of her heart, and he could only watch and wait, and try by patience to be the steadier warmth that might outlast the false one. So he tried. He set himself that hard January to be to Emmeline what her father had asked, a companion, a guide, a steady presence. And he found to his torment that the effort was no effort at all, that the hours he spent in her company were the only hours he now lived for, and that the very thing that made him strong for her was the thing that was slowly wrecking him. They read together in the evenings, the two of them and the dozing Miss Grafton by the library fire, and he discovered that Emmeline had a quick, hungry, undisciplined mind that had been fed at random and was starving for real matter, and he began, almost without deciding to teach her history and the classics in translation and the working of the estate and the great slow movements of the world beyond the park wall. She learned with a swiftness that delighted and alarmed him. She argued with him once she grew bold enough, with a spirit that no one had shown him in 20 years, and he found that he lived for the argument, for the flush that came into her face when she thought she had caught him out, for the laugh she gave when he turned the tables. He had been alone so long. He had built his solitude like a fortress and called it peace, and now this grave, bright, orphaned girl had walked into it carrying a candle, and he could not, though his honor depended on it, bring himself to wish her gone. The dreams did not cease. He learned to live above them the way a man learns to live above a wound that will not heal, rising each gray morning with the ache of them still in him, dressing, going down, being correct. He rode hard in the bitter weather to drive the blood down out of his head. He took to sleeping ill and eating little and working late over the ledgers, and Mrs. Penhallow scolded him for growing thin, and Gower watched him with the grave, silent attention of an old servant who sees more than he says. He confided in no one. There was no one to confide in. The shame of it was too great, and the danger to Emmeline too near, and so he carried it alone, as he had carried every burden of his life alone, and told himself that a man could carry anything if he only refused to set it down. It was the great storm at the end of January that brought the false dawn, and undid a little of his careful distance, and taught him, too late, exactly how far the thing in him had gone. The snow came down for 2 days without ceasing, and on the second night the wind rose to a gale that shrieked in the chimneys and drove the drifts against the north front, until the ground floor of the east wing was blocked to the sills. The Fentons could not have sent a carriage across the county in such weather had they wished to. Vain, for 2 blessed days, might as well have been in Leicestershire. The great house was cut off, an island of firelight in a howling white sea, and the Duke and his ward were thrown together in it with a completeness that neither the servants nor even Lady Honoria could quite prevent. On the second night the wind woke him near 2 in the morning, a crash, glass, somewhere below, and he rose and lit a candle, and went down in his dressing-gown to find that the storm had burst a window in the small morning-room, and the snow was driving in across the floor. And there already was Emmeline, a shawl over her nightgown and a single candle guttering in her hand, staring at the ruin of the window with her dark hair loose about her shoulders, and the Duke stopped in the doorway as though he had walked into a wall. He had never seen her hair down. It fell nearly to her waist, dark and heavy and shining in the candlelight, and she looked, standing there in her white nightgown with the snow whirling behind her through the broken glass, so young and so unguarded and so unbearably lovely that for one terrible instant the Duke could not move or speak, and every honorable resolution he had made stood useless in him like a spent guard. Then she saw him, and gave a little cry and clutched the shawl to her throat, and the spell broke, and he became again what he must be. "Go back to the fire in the hall," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. You will take your death. I will see to this, go, Emmeline, at once." And she went, and he wrestled a heavy shutter across the broken window with hands that were not quite steady, and stood a long moment afterward in the cold and dark, breathing, mastering himself, before he trusted himself to follow her. He found her in the hall by the banked fire, kneeling to build it up, her loose hair falling forward, and he stood at a careful distance and helped her feed the flames, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the storm howled beyond the walls, and it was the most dangerous hour of his life, and he knew it. "You are cold," he said at last. "You should go up." "I cannot sleep in this," she said. "The wind, it sounds like the sea. I used to be afraid of it as a girl, and my father would sit up with me until it passed." Her voice caught very slightly on the word father, and she looked into the fire and did not go up, and the Duke, against every screaming caution of his conscience, could not bring himself to send her. So they sat at a proper distance on either side of the great hearth, and the fire climbed and threw its warmth against the cold. And slowly, in the strange intimacy of the sleepless small hours, Emmeline began to talk of her father, of her childhood, of the mother she scarcely remembered, of her loneliness at the seminary in Cheltenham, where the other girls had homes to go to at Christmas, and she had none, of her fear, kept always behind her composed face, of being alone in the world, with no one whose first care she was. She talked as a lonely soul talks when at last it finds a listener it trusts, spilling out the small hoarded griefs of a young life. And the Duke listened, and asked the quiet question that drew the next confidence, and found himself, near dawn, telling her a thing he had told no living creature, of his own boyhood, of his cold father and his frightened mother, of the brother lost at sea, of the marriage made for him at 20 to a woman he had never loved and could not save, of the long gray solitude he had called peace, because he had not known there was any other name for it. "You are not alone now," Emmeline said softly when he had finished. She was looking at him across the firelight, her loose hair a dark cloud about her pale face, her eyes full of a tender, grieving warmth that went into him like a blade. "Neither of us is. I have thought sometimes that perhaps my father knew that he did not give me to you only for my sake. Perhaps he thought you needed guarding too in your way, and that we might guard each other. I hope that is not a foolish thing to say. But I think I am glad, in the midst of everything, that it was you he chose. I do not know what would have become of me otherwise." The Duke sat very still, and the fire burned, and the storm was dying beyond the walls into a thin gray light, and he understood with a clarity that was worse than any dream that he loved her. Not the guardian's love he had told himself he felt, not the tender duty he had claimed, but the whole helpless love of a man for a woman, deep and settled and past all recall, and that she, in her innocence, in her trust, in her orphaned gratitude, had just spoken to him the sweetest and most dangerous words he had ever heard, and had meant by them nothing, nothing at all, but the affection of a daughter for the good father the world had given her back. He rose. He had to rise. He could not answer her sitting there, and he did not trust what his face might do. He went to the tall window and looked out at the dawn coming gray and clean over the snow-buried park, and he mastered himself, breath by breath, as he had mastered himself over the broken window, and when he could speak he said, without turning, in a voice from which he had scoured every trace of what was in him, "It is nearly light. The worst is over. You should go up now and sleep, Emmeline. Mrs. Penhallow will scold us both if she finds you frozen at the hearth." He heard her rise, heard the soft sounds of her gathering her shawl, and he did not turn to watch her go because he did not trust himself to watch her go. "You were not foolish," he added more quietly to the cold glass. "What you said, you were not foolish at all." She was gone up the great dark stair, her candle a small warm light climbing into the shadows, before he turned. And the Duke of Harnwick stood alone in the gray dawn in his silent house, a strong man undone, and knew that the false peace was over, that he could no longer pretend, even to himself, that what he felt was fatherly, or safe, or anything but a mortal danger to the one soul on earth he had sworn to protect. He had two choices now, and he saw them both with a terrible clarity as the light came up. He could master it in silence and go on, be her guardian, find her a husband, give her away, and carry the truth to his grave unspoken, which was the honorable road and would very likely break him. Or he could send her away to his aunt, to some safe, respectable household far from Harnwick and far from him, where his ruinous heart could do her no harm and the county's whisper could find no fuel, which was also honorable and would break him faster. What he could not do, what honor forbade him with an absoluteness that admitted no argument, was to speak, to breathe one word of it to her, to take one particle of advantage from her trust, her loneliness, her orphaned gratitude, the awful power his guardianship gave him over her whole undefended life. She had come to him with nothing and no one, and had placed her entire faith in his protection, and a man who would use that, who would turn a dead friend's daughter's helplessness to the purpose of his own desire, was not a man at all, whatever his title, and the Duke of Harnwick would sooner have walked into the snow and lain down in it than become such a thing. He went up as the servants began to stir, and shut himself in his room, and did not come down to breakfast, and sent word that estate business kept him. And he sat alone through that whole white morning with his head in his hands, and wrestled with his honor and his heart in a silence that no one saw, and came at last, near noon, to the beginning of a resolution that would cost him everything he had left. He would send her away. It was the only safety for her name, for her heart, and for his own crumbling honor. He would find some pretext, some kind and plausible reason, and he would send Emmeline Fairfax out of Harnwick and out of the reach of the thing he had become, and he would do it soon, before the storm in him broke past his failing walls and swept them both away. He did not yet know that Sir Roderick Vane, patient and clever and entirely without conscience, was at that very hour making a plan of his own, and that between the Duke's honor and the fortune hunter's greed, the safety Emmeline believed she had found at Harnwick was about to come apart in both their hands. He did not send her away at once. That was his first failure, and he knew it for a failure even as he committed it, and forgave himself as men forgive themselves the sins they most wish to commit. He told himself there were practical difficulties. His aunt was still at Harnwick and would demand a reason. Emmeline was but 3 months out of her deepest mourning, and to uproot her again so soon would be a cruelty. The roads were foul with the thaw. There was the matter of the wardship accounts, which wanted his signature and his presence. All of it was true, and none of it was the truth, which was simply that he could not yet bring himself to give up the sight of her, and that every day he delayed he told himself would be the last, and every day the last day did not come. And so February wore on, and the snow melted into a gray wilderness of mud, and Sir Roderick Vane came back. He came often now. The Duke could not decently bar him without a cause that would be seen for jealousy, and he had resolved, with cold calculation, that the better course was to keep the man where he could watch him, for a fortune hunter thwarted grew reckless, and a fortune hunter humored grew careless, and the Duke wanted Vane careless, wanted him to make the misstep that would let honor do openly what jealousy might not. So he received the baronet with a chilly correctness, and watched him court Emmeline under his own roof with a patience that cost him more than open war would have done, and waited for the man to overreach. Vane overreached in the last week of February. He asked the Duke, with beautiful formality, for a private interview, and the Duke, who knew perfectly well what was coming, granted it, and received him in the library among the books, and stood while Sir Roderick, with every appearance of manly feeling, requested his Grace's permission to pay his addresses to Miss Fairfax with a view to marriage. "My sentiments," Vane said, "I flatter myself your Grace has observed. They are of the deepest and most honorable kind. I am not a rich man, I will not insult your Grace by pretending otherwise, but my name is old. My heart is entirely Miss Fairfax's, and I would count her fortune as nothing beside the happiness of making her mine. I ask only the chance to win her regard, with your blessing and under your eye." It was very well done. The Duke, who had heard 100 men lie across 100 tables, could almost have admired the craftsmanship of it. He let the silence stretch until Vane's easy smile began, very slightly, to stiffen. Then he said, in a voice as level and cold as the winter light through the tall windows, You will forgive me, Sir Roderick, if I am plain. I am my ward's guardian, and her father entrusted to me the ordering of any match, and I take that trust as gravely as any duty of my life. I have made inquiries. A man in my position always makes inquiries. I know the state of your affairs in Leicestershire. I know of the debts at your clubs and elsewhere. I know of the young lady in Bath, and of the settlement that was found wanting, and of what was paid to keep the matter quiet. He watched the color leave Vane's handsome face and the smoothness go out of it, and he did not raise his voice by a single degree. You are a hunter of fortune, sir. You have made a trade of it, and you are good at your trade, and you have chosen my ward as your next mark because she is young and grieving and rich, and had, you supposed, no one to make inquiries on her behalf. In that last particular you were mistaken. You will not have her. You will not have 1 farthing of her fortune, nor 1 hour more of her company than I can prevent. My consent, which her father's will requires, you will never obtain while I draw breath. And if you have in you 1 grain of the honor you counterfeit so prettily, you will withdraw from this county quietly, and spare her the knowledge of what you are. For a moment Vane's true face showed, the reckoning eyes gone flat and ugly, the mouth thin, and the Duke saw the man beneath the manner, and knew him for what he had suspected. Not merely a fortune hunter, but a dangerous one, of the kind that does not withdraw quietly when the door is shut, but looks instead for the window. Your Grace is very sure of your ward's obedience, Vane said softly, and the smoothness had come back, but there was a threat under it now. She is of age, I think, 22, a woman grown, not a child to be ordered, and devoted to your Grace by all I have seen, quite touchingly devoted. He let the words hang, and his eyes were watching the Duke's face with a horrible, calculating attention, and the Duke understood with a cold drop of the heart that this man too had a nose for the truth of a heart, and had caught the scent of the thing the Duke thought he had hidden from all the world. It has been remarked upon your Grace's devotion to your ward, and hers to you. A great many people have remarked upon it. It would be a pity if the remarks were to grow less kind. A young woman's reputation is such a fragile thing. He bowed, all courtesy again, poison wrapped in silk. But I am sure your Grace has considered all this far more deeply than I will withdraw, as you suggest. For the present, good day. He was gone before the Duke could answer, and the Duke stood alone in the library with the letter of his refusal still in his mouth, and the taste of the threat like iron behind it, and understood that he had not defeated Vane at all. He had only shown Vane the weapon he had been searching for. He went to his aunt that night. It was time, and past time, and the storm scene at the hearth had taught him that he could no longer trust himself, and Vane's silken threat had taught him that Emmeline's very safety now depended on removing her from the reach of the whisper. He found Lady Honoria in her sitting-room with the pug and her embroidery, and he told her not all of it, never all of it, but enough, that he had refused Vane, that the man had gone off with a threat on his lips, that the county's talk had grown to a point where his ward's good name was in danger under his roof, and that he wished, for Emmeline's sake, to send her away to some safe and respectable household where the whisper could find no fuel. His aunt heard him out with her sharp old eyes fixed on his face, and when he had done she set down her embroidery, and there was in her look a shrewdness and, unexpectedly, a great gentleness that undid him more than any scolding could have. "Julian," she said quietly, "look at me." He looked at her. "How long," she said, "have you been in love with that girl?" The Duke did not answer. He could not. He stood in the middle of his aunt's warm little room and looked at her, and his silence was the whole of his answer, and Lady Honoria nodded slowly, as though a thing long suspected were confirmed. "I have watched you these 2 months," she said. "I am old, and I have buried a husband and 2 sons in a world of illusions, and there is very little left in this life that I cannot see. You are killing yourself by inches, my dear, and doing it in silence, as you have done everything since you were a boy, and I have held my tongue because I could not see what was to be done, and I did not wish to shame you. But do not, I beg you, dress it up to me as concern for the county's chatter. You wish to send her away because you cannot trust yourself to keep her. Is that not the truth of it? Yes, the Duke said. The word came out of him like something torn. God forgive me, yes. Then hear an old woman. She reached out and took his hand, her rings cold against his fingers, and her voice was not sharp now at all. There is no shame in what you feel, Julian. She is not your daughter, she is not your blood. She is a woman grown of full age, and you are a widower of 37, and there is no law of God or man that forbids you to love her. The world would talk, yes, the world always talks, but the world's talk is not sin. What would be sin is to take advantage of her trust, to use your power over her, to press yourself upon a girl who looks to you for a father and has nowhere else on earth to turn. That you must never do, and I see well enough that you know it, or you would not be tearing yourself to pieces. But there is a great space, my dear, between using her trust and denying your own heart to death. And there may, I say only may come a day when the honorable course is not to send her away and die of it, but to court her openly, honestly, as any man courts any woman, with her free consent and her clear eyes, and let her choose you or refuse you as a free woman may. That day is not today. She is grieving, and vain has muddled her, and she thinks of you still as her guardian and her father's friend. But do not send her away in despair, Julian, and shut the door forever on a thing that might yet, in time, and honorably be won. Send her only if you must, and in the meantime trust yourself a little more. A man who suffers so to do right is not a man in any danger of doing wrong. The Duke could not speak. He stood with his aunt's cold, ringed hand in his and his throat closed, and his eyes stinging in a way they had not stung since he was a boy, and it was a long moment before he could master himself enough to bow his head and press her fingers and say, "Lo, you are wiser than I ever gave you credit for, aunt, and kinder." "I am a wicked old woman," said Lady Honoria briskly, taking up her embroidery again to cover the moment, "and if you repeat a word of this to a living soul, I shall deny it and box your ears. Now go to bed. And do not send that child anywhere in the state you are in tonight. Sleep on it. Everything looks like a gallows at midnight and like a garden fence by morning." He did not send her away. His aunt's words had lodged in him, and though they gave him no ease, the honorable road she pointed to lay so far off, past so much grieving and doubt, that he could scarcely believe in it. They gave him, at least, a reason to wait that was not merely his own weakness. He would guard Emmeline. He would keep Vane off. He would let time do its slow work and let her grief heal, and let her come, if she ever came, to see him with a woman's clear eyes rather than an orphan's grateful ones. And if that day never came, he would have his answer, and would give her away to a better man with what grace he could find. It was a thread of hope so fine he was ashamed to hold it, but he held it. And for a few weeks, as the winter broke into a cold, reluctant spring and the snowdrops came up under the park wall, it seemed almost that the thread might hold. Vane kept away. The whisper, deprived of fuel, seemed to quiet. Emmeline, out of her mourning now into soft grays and lavenders, grew easier, brighter, laughed more readily. She rode out with the Duke in the thin sunshine and argued with him over books by the fire, and once, on her birthday, when he gave her a small worn volume of Italian poems he had chosen with a care he would not confess, she thanked him with a look so warm and so unguarded that he carried it in him for days like a coal. It was not happiness. It was too shadowed with all he could not say for that. But it was a kind of peace, fragile and stolen, and the Duke let himself, foolishly, begin to believe in it. He should have known better. He had lived too long and lost too much to trust a quiet season. For Sir Roderick Vane had not left the county at all. He had only drawn back into the shadows to nurse his greed and his grudge, and to lay, with the patience of a man who had done such work before, a plan that would strike at the Duke through the one door his guardianship could not bar and his honor could not defend. The plan to take Emmeline's fortune not with her guardian's consent, which he could never win, but without it by ruin, by scandal, by a compromise so public that marriage would be the only way to mend it. The blow, when it fell, fell on a soft gray evening in March, and the Duke, sitting content in his library with the false peace still warm around him, had no more warning of it than a man has of the lightning that has already struck. The letter came to Emmeline by a hand not the post's, and she brought it to the Duke that gray March evening with her face gone white, and that was the beginning of the dark hour. He knew at once that something was wrong. She came into the library without knocking, which she never did, and stood just inside the door with a folded paper in her hand and her whole slight body trembling. And when he rose and crossed to her, she looked up at him with such fear and such shame in her clear eyes that his heart turned over. "You told me," she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "to bring you anything that touched my heart, before it was decided. I have brought you this. I do not understand all of it, but I am afraid of it, and I did not know where else to go." And she put the letter into his hand. He read it standing at the window in the last of the light. It was from Vane, and it was a masterpiece of its wicked kind, a letter of passionate protestation, of a love that could not be denied, of a fortune despised beside the treasure of her heart, and threaded through it with the greatest cunning, a plan. His Grace, the letter said, would never consent. His Grace was proud, cold, jealous of his ward's affection, determined to keep her mute at Harnwick and to bestow her at last on some titled dotard of his own choosing. There was no hope of winning her by honest means, for the tyrant guardian stood in the way. But love found a road where honor feared to tread, and if she loved him, as he dared to hope she did, she had only to meet him secretly on the Thursday evening at the crossroads beyond the park gate where a chaise would be waiting, and they would be over the border and wed before her guardian knew she was gone, and all his cold tyranny would be undone forever. She was of age. No one could gainsay it. One brave step and she was free and his, and beyond the reach of the man who ruled her. The Duke read it through and folded it, and for a moment the rage in him was so great and so cold that he could not trust himself to speak. It was not merely the elopement, that was the common coin of such men and might have been managed. It was the calculation beneath it, plain to his experienced eye though hidden from hers. Vane did not truly mean to reach the border. A chaise, a spring evening, an unmarried heiress carried off alone with a man for a night on the public road, that was all he needed. Whether they married or not, whether the Duke overtook them or not, the thing would be done. She would be compromised, ruined, her name broken past mending, and then Vane had only to present himself as the honorable suitor ready to repair the damage he had himself contrived, and the Duke, to save Emmeline from utter social ruin, would be forced to consent to the very marriage he had refused. It was a trap with no honest exit. It caught her whether it succeeded or failed. And Vane, the Duke saw now with terrible clarity, had built it precisely because he had understood that the Duke's own honor and the Duke's own hidden love could be turned into the walls of the cage. For to expose Vane publicly was to expose Emmeline to the whisper, and to fight him was to feed the scandal, and to let her go was unthinkable, and every road the Duke's conscience could take led straight back into the fortune hunter's hand. He looked up from the letter at Emmeline's white, frightened face, and he set aside his rage because she needed him steady, and being steady for her was the one thing left in the world he knew how to do. "You have done exactly right," he said, and his voice was very gentle. "You have done the bravest and the wisest thing, Emmeline, and I want you to hear me say it because you are ashamed and you have no cause to be. This letter is the work of a scoundrel. Everything in it is a lie, every word of love, every word against me. He does not want you. He wants your fortune, and he has planned to take it by ruining you so that I should be forced to give you to him to save your name. That is the whole of it. That is what he is." He watched her take it in, watched the shame in her face turn slowly to a sick understanding, and he ached to spare her it and could not. "He counted on your loneliness and on your grief and on your kind heart and on your believing the worst of me, that I am cold and jealous and a tyrant. Do you believe it?" "No," she said, and the word broke from her with a sob she could not hold back, and the tears came at last, the tears she had held behind her composed face since the day of her father's grave. "No, I never believed it. I read it, and I was afraid. But not of you, never of you. I did not know what to do." And he made it sound as though I had no one, as though I were a prisoner. "And I know that is not true. I know you have been nothing but good to me. I know it." She was weeping now past all her pride, her hands over her face, and the Duke stood before her in an agony of restraint. wanting more than he had ever wanted anything in his life to take her into his arms and hold her while she wept, and not daring, not permitting himself, because she was in his charge and in his power and undone with grief, and there was that in his own heart which made the smallest touch a peril. So he did the hardest thing of his life. He kept his hands at his sides. He drew a chair and set it gently behind her and made her sit, and he gave her his own handkerchief, and he knelt on one knee before her chair, a guardian, a father, at a careful distance, and let her weep, and said only over and over in a low, steady voice, "You are safe. You are safe, Emmeline. No one shall harm you while I live. You are safe." When the storm of her weeping had passed, he told her, plainly and completely, what must be done, for the danger was not over, and this was the dark hour and not the end of it. Vain, refused and exposed, would not simply slink away. A man who had built so careful a trap did not abandon it because one turn had failed. And the Duke was right. For the following evening, the very Thursday named in the letter, Sir Roderick Vane came to Harnwick. He did not come to elope. He came, brazen and smiling, in his best coat, to pay a call, and he brought with him, by cold design, 2 witnesses: Lady Caro, whose malice he had cultivated all winter, and a gossiping neighbor of unimpeachable respectability and bottomless curiosity, both of whom he had contrived, by hint and suggestion, to bring to Harnwick on that particular evening in the expectation of witnessing a scandal. For Vane's plan had a second edge. If Emmeline would not come to the crossroads, he would bring the crossroads to Harnwick. He would let it be seen, before witnesses who would carry it to every drawing-room in the county, that Miss Fairfax and Sir Roderick Vane had an understanding, a secret correspondence, an intimacy that her guardian was cruelly and jealously suppressing, that there was, in short, exactly the scandalous something that Lady Caro had been whispering of all winter, save that Vane would paint it as the Duke's tyranny rather than the Duke's desire. Either way the glass was broken. Either way Emmeline was ruined, and Vane stepped forward to marry the wreckage and pocket the fortune. The Duke saw the shape of it the moment Gower announced the 3 of them together, and he understood that the battle would be fought in the next quarter hour, in his own drawing-room, in the presence of the 2 most dangerous tongues in the county, and that Emmeline's whole future hung on how he carried it. And he carried it that night, as he had carried the worst hours of his life, cold, still, and utterly master of himself. A man who had spent 20 years in the great rooms of power learning exactly this: how to win a thing that cannot be won by force, with nothing but nerve and a level voice. He received them with perfect courtesy. He did not rage. Rage was what Vane wanted. Rage would have looked like guilt. He was gracious to Lady Caro, gracious to the gaping neighbor, gracious even to Vane. And then, at the moment of Vane's choosing, when the baronet turned the conversation with silken malice toward the great affection between your Grace and your lovely ward, which the whole county has so remarked, and Lady Caro's eyes glittered and the neighbor leaned, and the Duke rose, and went unhurried to a small writing-table, and took from it Vane's own letter, and laid it open before the 2 witnesses on the table where the candlelight fell full upon it. "Since Sir Roderick raises the matter of affection," he said, in a voice of the utmost calm, "the company had better see the form his own has taken." And he let them read it, the elopement, the chaise at the crossroads, the whole squalid plot in Vane's own unmistakable hand, while the fortune-hunter's face went first white and then a mottled gray, and Lady Caro's malicious anticipation curdled into scandalized comprehension, and the respectable neighbor drew back from Vane as from a leper. "My ward," the Duke went on into the ringing silence, "brought me this letter the moment she received it, of her own free will, because she is a young woman of honor, and she saw it for what it is, an attempt to abduct her, ruin her, and so extort her fortune. Sir Roderick's affairs I have had inquired into. They are known to my man of business, and to certain gentlemen in Bath, and are of a piece with this. I imagine, Lady Caro, that a woman of your discernment requires nothing further." He turned his level gaze upon Vane, and his voice dropped to something very quiet and very hard. "You will leave my house, sir. You will leave this county tonight. If you are seen within 20 miles of my ward again, or if one word against her name is traced to you or to any tongue you have set wagging, I will lay the whole of this before the magistrates and before every club and every drawing-room in England, and I will not rest until you are a ruined man in fact as well as in fortune. You have made a trade of preying on defenseless women. You have chosen the wrong one. Get out." And Vane, exposed before the very witnesses he had brought to destroy Emmeline, with his own letter in the candlelight, and the Duke's cold certainty leaving him not 1 inch of ground, got out, and the neighbor bustled after him full of appalled importance. And Lady Caro, who understood better than anyone in the room that the story she now carried to the county was not the Duke's shame but Emmeline's vindication and Vane's disgrace, gathered her shawl and her poison and departed, robbed of her whisper. To spread instead, for a scandal must be spread, whatever its shape, the tale of the fortune hunter unmasked, and the brave young ward who had spurned him and the noble guardian who had defended her. Which was, for once, the truth, and did Emmeline nothing but honor, and the Duke had known it would, and had wagered everything on it and had won. He should have been triumphant. He had saved her name, her fortune, her whole future, snatched her back from the very edge of ruin by nerve and cold command, and turned the scandal that was meant to destroy her into the thing that crowned her. Vane was finished. The whisper was dead. Emmeline was safe. And the Duke, when the house was quiet again and the danger past, went alone into the dark library and shut the door and stood in the blackness with his back against it, and found that he had never in his life been so wretched. For it had come to him, in the white heat of that confrontation, exactly and unbearably why he had fought so hard, not with a guardian's cold duty but with a lover's terror, that he had been fighting not for Edmund's daughter, but for the woman he could not live without, and the very violence of his victory had shown him, past all further self-deception, the truth he had spent all winter trying to bury. That he loved Emmeline Fairfax past all reason, past all honor, past all hope of cure, and that in saving her he had proved to himself beyond any doubt that he could no longer be trusted to guard her, because a guardian does not feel, standing before the man who would take his ward, that he would gladly kill him and be damned. He had won her safety and lost his own last defense, and now in the dark hour closed over him fully, and he saw with a terrible cold clarity that his aunt's far-off honorable day would never come, that he had deceived himself with that thread of hope, that a man in the grip of what gripped him could not court his own ward, could not so much as remain under the same roof with her, without either destroying her or destroying himself. There was only one thing left that a man of honor could do. He must send her away, not in a week, not when it was convenient, now, before the thing in him broke past the last wall and did to Emmeline in some unguarded hour the very injury he had just saved her from at Vane's hands. He wrote to his aunt that night, and to a cousin of unimpeachable respectability in York who would take Emmeline into a large, warm, proper household full of daughters in safety, far from Harnwick and far from him. He wrote the letters with a steady hand and a heart like a stone, and he sealed them, and he laid them by for the morning post, and he told himself it was the last honorable act left to a man who had failed at every other. And then he sat alone in the cold dark until dawn, the strong Duke of Harnwick, and did not weep, because he had forgotten how, but bowed his head at last onto his folded arms on the desk, in the blackness, in the silence, and let the whole crushing weight of what he must do settle over him unresisted, and understood that he was about to give up with his own hand, for honor's sake, the one thing that had ever made his cold life worth the living of it. It was Emmeline who broke the thing open, in the end, and she did it the morning the letters lay sealed on the hall table waiting for the post. She came to him in the library after breakfast, and he knew the moment she entered that she had learned of it. Mrs. Penhallow, perhaps, had seen the direction on the letter to York and Guest, or Gower, who missed nothing, had let something fall, for her face was not pale now but very still and very white, and her hands were not trembling but clasped hard before her in the old way, the way they had been clasped over her worn black gloves at her father's grave. And the Duke, seeing it, felt his resolution and his heart come to war within him, and could not for a moment speak. "You are sending me away," she said. "It was not a question. To your cousin in York, Mrs. Penhallow saw the letter. Is it true?" He could not lie to her. He had never lied to her in all the winter of his torment. He had concealed and been silent and guarded his face, but he had never lied, and he would not begin now at the end. "It is true," he said. "Why?" And now her composure cracked and the hurt came through it, raw and bewildered, worse than any weeping. "What have I done? I thought, after last night, after all your goodness, I thought I was safe here. I thought this was home, the first home I have had since my father, and now you are sending me away like a parcel, to strangers without a word, without even asking me why. Tell me what I have done and I will mend it. Only do not send me away, please. I could not bear it. I have nowhere." She stopped, pressing her hand hard against her mouth, fighting for the composure that had always been her armor and finding it gone. "I am sorry. Forgive me. You have every right. You are my guardian. You may dispose of me as you think best, and I have no claim. Only I did not think you wished me gone." The Duke stood behind the great desk with the sealed letters between them and looked at her white, stricken, uncomprehending face, at the hurt he had put there, at the trust breaking in her eyes. And he understood that he had come to the end of his strength and the end of his silence both. He could send her away cruel and unexplained, and let her carry into her whole future life the belief that he had grown tired of her, that she had done some nameless wrong, that the one home she had found had cast her out without cause. He could do that to her, to spare his honor the danger of the truth. Or he could tell her the truth, all of it, and trust her, a woman grown, of full age, of clear mind, to hear it and to judge, and to choose freely for herself what should be done. His aunt's words came back to him. Let her choose you or refuse you as a free woman may. He had thought that day would never come. And here it was, come upon him unlooked for in the gray March morning, forced open by the very cruelty he had meant as kindness. He came round the desk. He did not approach her closely. He stopped at a proper distance, a table's length between them, and he set his hands on the back of a chair and gripped it, and he made himself look at her, and he told her the truth. "You have done nothing," he said. "Nothing, Emmeline. Hear me, for I am going to say a thing I ought perhaps never to say, and having said it I will abide entirely by your judgment whatever it is. I am not sending you away because you have done wrong. I am sending you away because I have." He drew a breath. It was the hardest breath of his life. "Your father on his deathbed asked me to guard you like a father. I swore it. I meant it with my whole heart. And I have failed him, not in my conduct. I have never by word or touch given you cause to fear me, and I never would. I would sooner die, but in my heart, Emmeline, I have failed him utterly. For somewhere in this long winter I ceased to feel toward you as a father feels. I came to love you, not as a guardian loves his ward, as a man loves the one woman he cannot live without. I have fought it since December. I have fought it every day and every night because you came to me orphaned and grieving and in my power, trusting me precisely because I was the one man on earth you need not fear. And a man who would turn that trust to the purpose of his own heart is a scoundrel worse than vain, and I would not be that. I could not be that, not to you, not to Edmund's daughter. And so I resolved to send you away, because I no longer trust myself to guard you. Because the danger to you, Emmeline, is no longer out there at the crossroads. It is here. It is me." The silence when he had finished was the loudest he had ever heard. She stood very still, her hand fallen from her mouth, her clear gray-green eyes fixed on his face, and he could not read her. He, who had read 100 faces, could not read the one that mattered, and he stood gripping the chair back and waited, in an agony without a name, for her to recoil, to be afraid, to look at him at last with the horror he had spent all winter dreading. She did not recoil. She did not look afraid. She looked at him for a long, long moment, and then the Duke would remember it to the end of his days, would remember it on his deathbed as the hour his true life began. She said, in a voice that shook but not with fear, "And you were going to send me to York, and never tell me, and let me think all my life that I had done something to make you weary of me." Her eyes were bright now, brimming. "You foolish, honorable, blind man. You were going to break both our hearts to spare me a thing I never wanted to be spared." He did not understand her. He was afraid to understand her. "Emmeline." "Do you imagine," she said, and now the tears came, but she was almost laughing through them, a sound of pure release. "Do you imagine that you have suffered this alone? Do you think I have not? Oh, I did not know what it was. At first I thought it grief, I thought it gratitude. I thought 100 proper foolish things, but that night in the storm, when you told me of your brother and your marriage and your long solitude, and would not look at me and sent me away so gently, I went up that stair, Julian, and I lay awake till dawn, and I knew that I did not feel toward you as a ward feels. I knew it, and I was ashamed of it, and I buried it because you were my guardian and I owed you everything, and I thought you saw me only as a charge, a duty, a burden your friend had laid on you. I thought if you ever guessed you would despise me for it or pity me and send me away. She pressed both hands to her wet face. And you were going to send me away, and I thought it was because you had guessed. The Duke stood rooted where he was, and the whole gray morning seemed to tilt and shine around him. And he was afraid still to move, to hope, to believe, for she was young and grieving and in his power, and he had sworn a sacred oath. And even now, even in the flood of what she had said, the old iron conscience held him. "Emmeline," he said, and his voice was not steady at all now, "you must be sure. You must be certain past all doubt that this is your own free heart, and not gratitude, not loneliness, not the trust of an orphan for the man who has stood in her father's place. I could not bear, do you understand, I could not bear to win you by any advantage of my office. I would rather lose you honestly than keep you by so much as the shadow of a wrong. You are of age. You have your own fortune, or you will have. I will this very day set in motion the resigning of my guardianship. I will place your affairs and yourself under the protection of my aunt, who loves you, so that there shall be no tie of dependence or authority between us, none, so that you shall be as free as any woman in England to refuse me and think no more of it. And then, and only if your own clear heart still speaks, then I would come to you, Emmeline, not as your guardian but as a man, with nothing over you and nothing owed, and ask you the question honestly. Will you let me do that? Will you let me court you fairly and choose me freely, or freely send me away?" And Emmeline Fairfax, through her tears, through her laughter, with her whole trusting valiant heart naked in her face, at last said, "Yes, oh yes, do it all, the guardianship, your aunt, every proper thing, do it all if it will let you believe me. But you great blind foolish man, I have already chosen. I chose in the storm. I have only been waiting all this winter for you to look at me and see a woman and not a duty. Look at me now, do you see her?" And he looked at her, and he saw her, and the Duke of Harnwick, who had guarded his heart all his hard life as a garrison guards a citadel, laid down his arms at last. He kept his word, even then, even in the flood of joy that broke over him. He did not touch her, not that morning. He went that very day, with a heart singing and a hand steady, to Halloran and to the lawyers, and he set in motion the formal resigning of the guardianship into the hands of his aunt. And Lady Honoria, when he told her all, called him a great fool for taking 6 months to do what any woman in the county could have told him in 6 minutes, and then wept, which she would afterward furiously deny, and gathered Emmeline into her thin old arms and told her she had wanted a daughter all her life, and had despaired of that stubborn nephew ever providing one. And when the papers were signed, and Emmeline was no longer his ward but a free and independent woman under his aunt's kind chaperonage, and the whole world could see that there was nothing of dependence or authority in it, then, and only then, in the last of the spring, the Duke of Harnwick courted Emmeline Fairfax openly and honorably, as any man courts any woman, in the sight of God and the county. He courted her properly, and it was the happiest season of his life. He took her driving in the open barouche where all the world could see them. He brought her small foolish gifts and grand serious ones. He walked with her in the reviving gardens and let her beat him at battledore on the south lawn, as she had beaten him at 15, and this time when she apologized for it, he laughed and told her he had never in his life been so glad to lose. And one evening in May, in the long drawing-room where his mother's pianoforte stood open, and the last gold light of the day came slanting through the tall windows and lay across the floor, he took both her hands in his the first time, that he had let himself take her hands, and went down on one knee before her, the great proud Duke of Harnwick, and asked her, in a voice that shook, to do him the honor, the undeserved and unlooked-for honor, of becoming his wife. And Emmeline, laughing and weeping at once, sank down onto her knees before him so that they were face to face, and put her arms about his neck and said yes, and yes, and yes, until he stopped the word with the first kiss he had ever allowed himself, gentle and reverent, and past all his winter's grief, in the gold light, in the room where he had first dreamed of her turning in a dance with her hand held out to him. The dream that had once shamed him past bearing, and had come true at last by no road but the honorable one. They were married in June, in the little church at Fairfax where her father was buried, so that in some fashion Edmund might be near. The county came, the whole county, for a scandal had turned to a romance, and there is nothing the world loves better, and Lady Caro, robbed of every whisper, was reduced to declaring loudly to anyone who would listen that she had always said there was a great affection there, and had she not been perfectly right. Lady Honoria wore grey silk and diamonds, and cried without shame, and denied it. Mrs. Penhallow and Gower and the whole of Harnwick's household stood at the churchyard wall in their Sunday best, and beamed as though the bride were their own. And the Duke of Harnwick, standing at the altar rail and watching Emmeline come up the aisle toward him on his own aunt's arm, for there was no one else to give her. And Lady Honoria had claimed the office with ferocious pride, in a gown of ivory silk with her mother's pearls at her throat and her father's love and her own free choice shining in her face, felt his throat close and his eyes sting, and made no attempt this time to master it, and let one tear fall unashamed before the whole watching world. Because it was the first day of the rest of his life, and he was not ashamed of anything any more. He had sworn to guard her like a father. He had, in the strangest and hardest way, kept that vow entire, for he had guarded her from the crows, from the fortune-hunter, from the whisperer, from ruin. And last and most fiercely of all, he had guarded her from himself, refusing every advantage his power gave him, until he could come to her at last with clean hands and an honest heart and nothing over her but love. And in keeping the vow so completely, he had won a thing Edmund had never dared to ask and never dreamed to hope. Not merely a safe marriage for his daughter to some worthy stranger, but a great and abiding love and a home, and a man who would spend the whole of the rest of his days making plain to her, in 10,000 small unwearying ways, that she was cherished. She who had come to him orphaned and grieving and alone, the vulnerable one, the overlooked one, the daughter of a dead man given into a cold man's keeping, and who had thawed that cold man's whole frozen heart simply by trusting him, and by being, against all his honor and all his resistance, entirely and unanswerably worth the loving. That night, when the last carriage had rolled away down the long avenue and the great house was quiet, the Duke stood with his wife at the tall window of the room that had been so long and so bitterly his alone, and looked out at the moon riding high and clear over the park, where the frost had once lain blue on the terrace, and the lake had lain like beaten iron, and where now the June dark was warm and full of the smell of roses. Emmeline stood within the circle of his arm, her dark head against his shoulder, and he thought of the winter, of the dreams that had shamed him, of the long torment of his honor, of the night he had sat in the dark with the sealed letters, and given up with his own hand, the one thing that made his life worth living, and of how it had all, by some grace he did not deserve and could not account for, come round at last to this. "You are very quiet," she said softly, looking up at him. "I am thinking," the Duke said, "that a man may guard a thing so carefully that he never dares to hold it and lose the whole use of his life to the guarding, and I am thinking that I was such a man until you came." He turned her gently to face him and took her face in both his hands and looked at her, at the woman, seen clear at last, and not the duty, at the choice freely given and freely made, at the wife who was his by no advantage and no oath but her own love. "I dreamed of you all that winter," he said low, "and hated myself for it and thought it the worst thing in me, and it was the truest thing in me. I only had to learn to deserve it." She smiled up at him, her whole heart in her face, and reached up and laid her hand along his jaw and said, "Then stop learning, my love, and come to bed. You have deserved it long enough." And the Duke of Harnwick, who had waited a whole hard lifetime for a happiness he had never believed he would be permitted, drew the curtain across the moonlit window and blew out the candle and went to her. He was never, from that night to the end of his long and gentle life, a cold man again. He grew famous in the county in later years, for a thing no one who had known the grim young duke would ever have predicted, for the plainness and the warmth with which he adored his wife, for the way his hard face changed when she came into a room, for the small attentions of a man who had learned late and forever how precious a thing he held, for the way, at the great table built for 40 where he had once dined alone among the shadows, he would reach without looking and cover her hand with his. They said, the county's old women, over their tea, that no woman in England was so cherished as the Duchess of Harnwick. And they were right, and the Duke would have been the first and the gladdest to tell them so. He had sworn to guard her like a father. He had ended by loving her like a husband, honorably, wholly, to the last day of his life. And the orphaned, overlooked, undefended girl who had come to his cold house one November afternoon with nothing in the world but her father's dying love and her own brave trust, she was, until the very end of both their days, the most treasured thing that a good and once lonely man possessed.